Hey YouTube, excuse my wet hair. I just came out the front door and I'm about to get started on farm chores, but I'm in a big hurry. So I'm gonna take you with me. I've called my mother-in-law to come give me a hand because we're still working on milk stand training some of our first Freshener goats, and it's definitely a two-person job. First though, I'm gonna run down and check out the garden. We have this planter bed thing right here by our front door. And I've been so focused on getting my garden in this year that I haven't even fooled with this thing. I came out here the other day and I've been kind of picking the weeds out, making sure it doesn't get too overrun with the intentions of planting something pretty, some flowers or some vines. But I came out the other day and I noticed that this tomato plant had sprung up here, but I didn't plant it. I have a suspicion that it could have volunteered from a plant that was up by here last year, and I'm hoping that's what it is because it was some variety a friend of mine brought up that grows kind of wild in South Texas, and I've never been able to identify what it was, but I'd love to have the opportunity to have some more seeds. Hey Gary. I'm gonna dig this thing up and take it down to the garden where I can guarantee that it'll be safe. I actually don't have an ideal place for this volunteer tomato plant, so I'm just gonna stick it here on the other side of the trellis where I have some others growing. I think it should work out okay. I've already got like 100 tomato plants in my garden, so I don't really need this, but I really am hoping it's that variety that I could never identify. Maybe this will give me a second chance of figuring out what it is, and I can save some of the seeds to have these tomatoes again next year. So my mother-in-law Jane is here. Jana, say hey.
Hey.
I called her for backup because of the goat milking today, but first we are going to tie up some of these tomato plants. We're going to use zip ties and just loosely connect them to these cattle panels because these tomatoes have just exploded in the last couple of days and several of them are laying over. The only problem with my garden currently is that when I planted all of these tomatoes, my son, Benjamin, the littlest farm boy, followed behind me, and as I placed popsicle sticks to mark the variety, he pulled it up behind me, and I didn't notice it till I got all the way to the end of this row, and he handed me a big stack of popsicle sticks. So we're in for a little bit of a surprise as these fruit, because I don't know what's what. I do know I did plant my cherry and grape varieties on this end, the pastes in the middle, and the slicers down on the other end. So at least I've got that information. That's pretty much it. To connect these to the cattle panel, I'm just going to take a zip tie. This is one of the longer ones. And I'm going to loosely wrap it around this tomato plant and just pull it till it barely clicks. I want this to have plenty of space to grow up. I don't want this to be restrictive. Even when these plants do get really big and heavy, this probably will cut into it some and it'll grow around it. However, I want to avoid it damaging the plant as much as possible. So we just do this really loose, and that holds the tomato plant up close to the cattle panel so it doesn't end up lying in the soil and getting sick. We're growing a lot of stuff on vertical supports this year, including climbing stuff like cucumbers and Kentucky Wonder pole beans, but we're also training yellow crookneck squash and zucchini squash to grow up trellises. It's not a natural climber, however, it is pretty easy to trellis. I'm kind of just learning. It's my first year to do this, but I'm going to show you what we're doing. This is one of the arch trellises that goes straight up. So what I've done is taken a zip tie and very loosely around the bottom attach this to the trellis. Now what I'm about to do is take these, and in little groups of 2 or so, I'm going to attach them now to this second level. See how loose this is? I don't want to cut the plant off, but I just want to train it to come up this way. Do the same thing here. Now I'm gonna do the same thing for all of these plants while Jaina works on trellising these to these vertical supports. On these, as you can see, we've had to kind of pull the plants back to the supports and tie them off loosely. This is not natural for them right now. You can tell it's kind of a pulling back. However, you want to catch them in that period where they're still pliable and they haven't set those really thick stems going off in the other direction. They'll actually adjust really quick. Here in the next couple of days when we come back out, all the leaves will be turned up in the right direction and they'll just begin growing this way. This one's a little further back from the trellis. Let me see this real quick. See how thick the stalks have gotten on this squash plant? If we had waited just a few more days, it would have been a lot harder to train this guy. As it is, these ones that are on the outside of the trellis, I'm going to just very loosely put a tie around, not even so much trying to get it all the way to the cattle panel, but just in that direction so that this whole stem area will just kind of start pointing and pulling towards this thing. Vertical gardening has a lot of benefits. You can expand the amount of space you have, like for instance squash plants like this. If you planted them traditionally, like on hills, you'd have to give like a 4-foot radius for this plant to just sprawl out. Another thing is, and if you've ever grown any sort of squash, you know this, they grow so fast that if you miss one in the garden for just a couple days, you end up with like a Franken squash that's 3 feet long and completely useless. So when they're on a vertical trellis, you see the fruit easier. It makes it a little easier to harvest. You're not having to crawl around and look underneath the leaves. It also helps with sickness. When you've got plants that are trellised to grow up rather than growing on the dirt, you don't end up with things as much like blight. It keeps them up out of the way of slugs. You still have to be mindful of pests and illness in your plants, but it does really alleviate that being a... Toby came out and asked me, what's that pepper smell? What is it that you're smelling?
Peppers.
Smells like peppers. It's actually these squash plants. They've got kind of a peppery smell to them, huh? Are you excited to eat them? Yeah, me too.
What did you eat for breakfast? It's all over your face.
Okay, goat time. So we have 6 goats that kidded this year. All of them were first fresheners, and that means all of them had to be trained to the milk stand, which it really depends on the goat's personality and how much they're used to being handled, but they have been difficult in varying degrees. So I'm gonna give you guys some tips on getting a first freshener to the place where they're comfortable being milked. I highly suggest, if it is at all possible, whenever a goat is getting close to kidding and you know she's never been milked before, start training her to the milk stand before she kids by feeding her her grain on the milk stand every day and not giving her the option to eat grain elsewhere. That'll get her used to the fact that that is a good place to be. Towards the end, as she gets closer, once she's used to hopping up on the stand to eat, you can pet on her, palpate her udder, just get her used to the fact that this is a good place where she gets to eat good food, but where she is also going to be handled. Hey goaties. Does nobody ever milk you? Are you screaming? This is Mayhem, and she kidded in February, so she's been doing this thing for a few months. It was a rough go training her, but now she hops right up. She lets me milk her no problem. She knows that the milk stand is where she gets fed, so she does not complain. Mayhem is kind of particular still, even though she is stand trained to milk. So I actually sit next to her and milk her from behind so that I can still have a good grip on the bucket. That is unusual. That's not necessarily the normal way to do things, but you kind of just got to figure out what works. This is Maggie. She's a first freshener that kidded about 3 weeks ago. So she's still very new to being milked. However, she has been pretty well behaved. She fights me a lot right at the beginning. But I thought Maggie was due about a month before she actually ended up kidding. So she was milk stand trained for over a month and a half. So it made a huge difference when it actually came down to starting to milk her, because she was already accustomed to coming in here to eat. So, thing with hers. What I usually do with a goat that I know is going to kick is I'll hold on to their leg, because she's going to try to put her foot in this milk bucket. She didn't. She did awesome. So she's been way better behaved than I thought she was going to be. Another tip whenever you're milking a first freshener, I keep some empty jars right here, and every time my milk pail gets about a cup in it, I go ahead and empty it into one of these jars. That way, if I do end up losing a milk pail and having it kicked over, I'm not losing an entire half gallon of milk. I'm just losing less than a cup. This is Polly. Well, this is Polly's backside, but Polyester was a little angel on the stand from the very beginning. Hopefully I don't jinx this by saying that. She actually is not having her kids separated at night. He's 2 weeks old tomorrow, so he'll start being separated then. But up until this point, what we do is we bring the goats in every morning, feed them their grain on the stand, and we go ahead and milk a little bit, but since their kids aren't separating, there's not a whole lot to milk, but it's really just for training and teaching them the ropes. Occasionally you just get a really docile goat that just lets you milk them and they don't argue. So far, Polly has been one of those, and I thank God for her, because next I'm gonna milk Charity, and I wake up every morning and go, oh, Charity. It's pretty normal for them to kick just a little bit whenever you first put your hand on. I just don't take my hand off. I get my hand on their udder, and even if they kick around a little bit, I don't move it. That's me telling them that's not gonna work. And like with Polly, that's just a reaction, you know. I mean, like, they kick their leg up once or twice. That's just the same reaction that they give when a fly lands on them. Polly!
That's the first time she's done that?
Yeah, that's the first time she's ever kicked the pail. This is actually incredibly docile for a first time milker. Even though she did splash me a little bit right there. The only thing is that her udder's pretty much empty because she still has a kid on her all the time. Okay, so Charity is about to show you how hard training a first freshener can be. This is after we've been working with her for 3 weeks. She lays down.
Is there something I can do? Or?
No, as long as she doesn't lay on my arm.
Okay.
There have been a couple of times that she has laid fully on my arm between her body and the bucket. Believe it or not, this is, there's the bucket, a huge improvement to what we were dealing with. One thing we have done to make this a little easier is whenever they go out of this stand after they're done being milked and having access to this grain, we put them over in another yard. So when we bring the grain out for the rest of the herd, these ladies do not have an option of getting grain anywhere else. This is their only place that they get to get grain at all, is on the milk stand. So partially that's a good thing. Like, for instance, Charity came up to the door today and got on the stand on her own. Before we cut all the other grain off, we had to catch her to bring her in here. Okay, so so Charity is obviously really difficult. She's improved a lot, a whole lot. That's actually way better than it was. The first few times we tried, it was absolutely impossible. We were afraid she was gonna hurt herself trying to get off the milk stand. So this is a huge improvement. I actually did get some milk out of her that I got to keep. Of course, I was emptying the bucket every few ounces. Now she still has twins on her that she is nursing. So when I take her out of here, I'm gonna put her over in this other yard with her kids. She won't have the option to get any more grain, but she will have free range with hay, and her kids will be able to go ahead and empty out her udder. She still has milk in her udder right now, but I'm done trying. We've ended on a pretty good note where she's standing up, she's allowing me to milk her, she's not kicking or laying down, and so but she stopped eating because she's stressed, and so I'm gonna stop on this good note and I'm gonna let her calm down and eat some of this grain. Then I'm gonna return her to her kids and know that they'll drain the udder out so she's not gonna get mastitis or anything. Okay, so each of our milkers get 2 scoops. These are 16-ounce mason jars, 2 scoops of this blend that we put together. The ones that, like the one I have that has triplets, and then the ones that are looking kind of skinny, I might give a little extra over that. Our blend for milkers includes a dairy goat pellet from the local feed store, another goat pellet from the local feed store, sweet feed, and alfalfa pellets. We like to mix this just in case something is out at the local feed store that we're not having to completely change their feed. Like for instance, if we bought a pre-mixed bag and that pre-mixed bag was out, we would have to really drastically change something in the meantime. However, if one of these elements is out and we have to substitute it with something else, it's not a drastic change in their feed. Goats are ruminants, and you can really upset their rumen by doing anything drastic as far as changing their feed. Alright, so I've got a little bit of an issue here. Nestle is a freshener because, you know, they all are, but she has 1 kid, and if you look at her udder here, one side is really full. This is after I've milked, and one side is really empty. Actually, this side is producing milk, and the other side is still producing colostrum. I'm gonna try to get a video of it so I can show you the difference of what they look like, but this is not a good thing. I'm actually going to get our milk machine going, and I'm going to milk out both sides morning and evening, especially the side that's producing colostrum, because I want the milk to kick in so that she doesn't end up with a really lopsided udder and permanent damage from this. Okay. Okay, that's the milk.
Okay, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay, if you see this coming out, it's really, really thick. And you can actually, well, I just kind of got myself there. You see how thick that looks? It looks kind of like sweetened condensed milk. That's colostrum. And she kidded, it's been less than a week ago, but her milk has come in on the other side, but not this side, which tells me that her kid is only nursing on one side. Now we definitely want to bring the milk in on both sides. Let me see if you can tell. You can see the difference between the colostrum and the milk in this bucket. And we are going to, we're gonna have to be diligent to make sure we're milking out this side where the milk hasn't come in yet, twice a day until we get milk coming in on that side. And her kid will probably stop favoring one side over time. If not, we'll have to continue milking out that side even though she is dam raising a kid. Okay, Pesky was the one who kidded most recently, and she actually has triplets, so that's why her bag doesn't look very full. We have not taken her kids away at night. They're only a week old today. I am going to go ahead and start. This is actually the first time I've really tried to milk anything up until this point. We've just been putting her on the stand and kind of rubbing her down. My camera died out there, but thankfully it was at the end whenever we were finishing up with Pesky, who was the last goat we were milking. That took us about an hour and a half for those 6 goats. However, there were other factors of that, like I was teaching Jaina to milk for the first time and taking video, and you know, several of the goats are learning. We brought in about 3/4 of a gallon of milk, which is not much for those goats, or I should say when they are trained and their kids are being retained at night, so they're being milked from full udders. We should be getting around 2.5 gallons a day. We'll see whenever we get there. Just a few things, just kind of wrapping it all up to remember. Milk stand training is a process, and it's just part of having a home dairy and having dairy animals. Obviously, we're dealing with a large breed in Nubians, and these are, you know, 100+ pound animals. So you have to be mindful of that. You have to be careful, and you have to be patient. Goats are prey animals, so by instinct, taking them away from their herd, putting them in an enclosed space, and locking their head in to a device that keeps them from moving is completely against their instinct. It's gonna freak them out. You losing your cool is actually just going to make the situation worse. If you get to a point where you're feeling really flustered with a flustered goat, like pause, try again in a minute. Really, you losing your patience is only going to compound the frustration of the situation, because they can feel your tension, and it's not going to help anything. Another thing you can do is bribe them with food that they like. Figure it out, you know, like animal crackers. I know somebody that gives their goat Sour Patch Kids. I like to put just a little extra molasses on their food, because molasses is good for them. It gives them a little extra nutrients, and it's sweet, so it gets them to stand still. It's something that they don't get anywhere else other than the milk stand. Like I said, you can make it so that they don't get access to grain other than on the milk stand, but you do need to be mindful that if you have a goat that's freaking out on the milk stand and not eating, and then you're withholding grain elsewhere, if they're not eating any grain at all, they can end up becoming malnourished. Their milk production is going to drop. So make sure, if you are keeping them from having grain in another situation, that they are eating on the milk stand. Even if you have to attempt to milk, stop at the best possible place, you know, like get to a good point, a good stopping point, and then maybe just pet them for a little while, calm them down, and allow them to eat. You want them to eat. One thing that we actually ended up having to do whenever we were stand training Mayhem was we actually had to go get her kid. Her little doeling Sue would cry, and Mayhem would panic on the stand. She would start kicking, she would start panicking, and so we actually would go get Sue when we were first training Mayhem on the stand. And we would put Sue in and just stand her on the stand with her. And then we would pet her while Sue would nurse. We would touch her udder while Sue would nurse. And she would still kick us. She would still panic a little bit, but it was way better than she was whenever she was absolutely adamant to get off the stand. She would actually stay put with the kid there. One more thing you can do if your bucket is kind of cumbersome whenever you're dealing with a goat that's moving around a lot or kicking, get a quart mason jar, because even if you have pretty small hands, a quart mason jar is easy to hold on to. If you have a smaller breed like a Nigerian, you might even could use like a pint mason jar and milk them directly into that, because that's going to be easier to get out of the way. We've done that with some of ours. We actually have a real small milk pail that is that's only 2 quarts, and so it's easy to get in and out of the way if they start kicking. Biggest piece of advice I have is just don't give up. It's all part of the process. This is it's not like you're a bad goat keeper because your goat is ornery on the milk stand. Like but sticking out the process and just denying the temptation to be incredibly frustrated or to give up and just sticking it out, you'll end up with good milkers. It's definitely worth it. Yeah, it's way easier to buy a doe that's already milk stand trained, but if you're genuinely getting a good healthy doe that's milk stand trained, you're going to pay for it. It's going to be expensive, and a lot of times you know, people will sell their difficult milkers. So if you buy a doe in milk, make sure you're asking, is this doe milk stand trained, so that you don't end up getting a really difficult milker that you have to go through this process with whenever you're paying a lot. And I mean, every doe that's milking right now had to be taught at one point to do it. So it really is just a process. It's worth it, but it's definitely, it's not, the cost is, it matches the reward. I mean, having a home dairy, a milking goat that behaves, that you open the gate, hops right up and eats, you milk and you let her down, it's awesome. It takes a little bit of work, but it's definitely worth it. I would say on my most difficult milkers, Charity we've been working with for about 3 weeks. And that's probably the hardest time we've had. Mayhem took about 2 weeks of consistently working with her every day until she was what I would call a decent milker. And then some of them have just been easy from the get-go. It's all about personality. All right, so I'm getting ready to leave the house. I've got ministry events this weekend, so I'm gonna go do that, and I will see you guys next time.